She was born in the 1172 approximately, and was one of the most powerful and influential women in the medieval world. She was of noble Anglo-Norman, Welsh and Irish ancestry and attended the notorious medieval royal courts of Europe. She was one of the most eligible and sought-after marriage alliances of the time because, as well as being highly educated and reputedly very beautiful, she was one of the wealthiest heiresses, owning large tracts of land, castles and money chests. Well, who is this lady, you might ask? Well, as you can see there, she was the only daughter of Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, Earl of Pembroke and Strigul and Lord of Leinster, and her mother was Aoife McMurrough, who was the daughter of Dermot McMurrough, the deposed King of Leinster. Now, Richard de Clare, better known to all of us as Strongbow, and we know he played a leading role in the Norman invasion of Ireland. So the invasion came about because Dermot was deprived of his kingship because he had abducted Dervagilla, the wife of the King of Breffni. And in order to recover his kingdom, he went to England and sought the help of King Henry II. He subsequently met Strongbow and the other Welsh barons, and they agreed to come and help him. And he made an agreement with Strongbow that for his assistance, he could have his daughter Aoife in marriage and the succession to Leinster. Well, as we know, Strongbow and his army were successful in restoring Dermot to his kingdom, and in August 1170, the day after the capture of Waterford, the marriage of Strongbow and Aoife took place in Reginald's Tower. And there you have the painting, the MacAleese painting, which hangs in the National Gallery in Dublin. Now, Dermot died the following year, and Strongbow claimed his inheritance of Leinster, but not without some opposition, because the granting of Leinster by Dermot to Strongbow went completely against traditional Irish law and practice, a fact that both Aoife's father and her husband chose to ignore. By 1172, Strongbow was now in Ireland, and he recognised the strategic importance of Kilkenny, situated as it is on the banks of the Nore, and this was the central spot for his kingdom of Leinster, and he commenced building a castle, which was a motte and bailey type of castle at the time. And it's probable that Isabel, his daughter, was born during this time. It's not certain recorded where her birth was. And Strongbow, unfortunately for him, he did not enjoy his newfound prosperity for very long, because he died just 4 years after getting the kingdom. And he left behind his wife Aoife, an only son and heir, Gilbert, who was only 3, and Isabel, who was probably 4 or 5. On the death of Strongbow, as there was no adult heir, the Crown then assumed responsibility for the interim administration of his estates. And as a widow, in accordance with feudal custom, Aoife was entitled to the use of 1/3 of the estate Strongbow possessed at the time of their marriage, as well as her lands in Ireland, mainly in Leinster. Then, in 1184, Gilbert, the son and heir, aged only 11, suddenly died, and his older sister, Isabel, who was just 13, was thrust into the limelight. As the only surviving heir, she was in line to become one of the most powerful and wealthiest independent women of medieval Europe. She became Countess of Pembroke in her own right, and she became heir to her mother's land in Leinster. She also inherited vast tracts of land in Wales and France, and the overlordship of many castles and strategic fortifications, including Chepstow, Milford Haven, and Pembroke. But her independence didn't last very long, because she was suddenly made a ward of the Crown, and she fell under the protection and control of King Henry II. For her own safety and to maintain control over who she would eventually marry, he had her placed in the Tower of London. Now, the Tower of London in those days would have been a royal palace and not a prison as it did become later. And she would have become part of the royal household, and as such, she would have been immersed in an aristocratic French-speaking world. And so, at the age of 17, Henry approved a marriage for her to his most trusted man, who happened to be William Marshal, the medieval world's most famous knight, who is considered by historians to be the greatest knight that ever lived. Henry saw that by arranging the marriage of Marshal to Isabel, his loyal courtier and knight would assume her titles and lands, as was the Norman custom, and in so doing would effectively secure them under the Anglo-Norman realm. And he would also be able to control the passage of her lands in Leinster and affect the balance of power in Ireland, where colonisation was still in its very early stages. Now, when Henry died in 1189, his son Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, he also saw the political advantages of the match, so he allowed it to go ahead, and in August 1189, the 17-year-old Isabel was married to the 43-year-old William Marshal. And the records point to a spectacular marriage at St. Paul's Cathedral, with subsequent celebrations in the City of London. And there you have the Ross tapestry portraying the marriage of the two of them. Now, the marriage of Isabel transformed Marshal's fame into fortune. The marriage typified the incredibly important political role that the marriage to an heiress played. Now, these marriages were not only used as rewards, but they were also used to elevate men to real positions of power. And in some cases, these men could help to change the face of a country, and William Marshal certainly was one of these. His marriage to Isabel was what gave him the status to have a real political effect. Upon the marriage of William to Isabel, her life would change forever, and she was thrown into the paths of some of the world's most famous and infamous monarchs, and she would play host to the greatest powers that the medieval world had ever seen. And despite the vast age difference between them, the marriage, by all accounts, was a remarkably happy and productive one, as she had 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls. Now, Isabel did not confine her role to being a wife and mother. She took an active part in the realm she now shared with her husband, and she took chief place amongst the council of the men who now owed service to Marshal. They became a well-travelled couple as her land stretched across into Normandy, which they visited together and where some of her children were born. And it was rare in this time in history for wives to travel with their husbands. William then got control of her lands in Wales, and he was created Earl of Pembroke, and she became his countess, but she already had inherited the title in her own right. He had difficulty gaining possession of her Irish lands for some time due to the opposition of Prince John, who was Henry II's son. He had been created Lord of Ireland and now was Marshal's overlord. Furthermore, John had been making grants of Isabel's lands to his own followers. Isabel and William eventually travelled to Ireland for the first time in 1200 to take possession of her lands. And it was during this time that work commenced on the building of a stone fortress, which is known as Kilkenny Castle. This was on the site of Strongbow's wooden motte and bailey, and it became their home in Ireland. Now, William was recalled to England after a few months, and he left Isabel behind. And in his absence, she became responsible for the control of the lands, and also she ruled Leinster. And to ensure the couple's submission to him, the king took William as a hostage. This was quite the custom of the day. The period was to see some great developments of castles, churches and towns in Kilkenny and Wexford mainly. History tells us that she oversaw the continuing construction of Kilkenny Castle, and that she was very involved in the development of the new town and port and the church of St. Mary's in New Ross. Also, the building of Tintern Abbey in Wexford and the nearby lighthouse at Hook was commenced. Tintern was very dear to her, as her de Clare ancestors had founded Tintern Abbey in Wales in an earlier period. The building of the Cistercian Abbey in Dush of Dúisc in Graignamanagh also started at this time. Now, Isabel remained in Ireland, or in Kilkenny, until sometime in 1203, and the couple returned again with their entourage to the castle in 1207. During this period, William Marshal issued a new charter for Kilkenny. Much of the old Kilkenny that we see today was developed at this time, including the separation of the old town known as Irish Town and the newer part, which was to be called High Town. High Town stretched from Parliament Street and High Street and incorporated the castle. St Mary's Church was built to serve the castle and the new High Town, and St Canice's continued to serve Irish Town. At this time as well, St John's Priory in John Street was another of their foundations. And we can see the ruins of the former, it was an Augustinian church. They can still be seen to this day. Now, the charter, which he brought in 1207, begins with the following paragraph. Now, it's dated 1207, and it actually begins with this paragraph. Be it known to all present and to come that I, William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, with the counsel and consent of my wife Isabella, have granted to my burgesses all the liberties that burgesses ought to have, insofar as it is in my power to confer them, to have and to hold forever from me and my heirs to them and their heirs. Now, this is one of the many occasions when Marshal included these words, with the counsel and consent of my wife Isabella, in the many charters and official documents that he issued at these times. Now, during this time, Meiler FitzHenry, a close ally and cousin of King John, was plotting a rebellion against Marshal. FitzHenry was the king's deputy in Ireland at the time. Marshal was summoned by the king to return to the court in England, but before he did so, he gathered together his loyal household and knights in the castle and addressed them as such. My lords, here you see the countess, who I have brought here by the hand into your presence. She is your lady by birth. She stays behind here with you as a pregnant woman. Until such time as God brings me back here, I ask you all to give her unreservedly the protection she deserves by birthright, for she is your lady, as we all know. I have no claim to anything here, save through her. He then left and returned to the displeased king, and Isabel stepped into the spotlight once more. Now, Isabel, she was undoubtedly a figure of respect to the barons of Leinster, a living link to her maternal grandfather Diarmaid McMurrough and her father Strongbow. She would have been well aware of the symbolic power of her presence to the warriors who had followed her father. She was a woman well used to military life and strategy, and this would serve her well in the crisis that followed. Marshal was no sooner out of the country when Meiler FitzHenry's men attacked and burned the port of New Ross, thus cutting off all supplies to Kilkenny and the castle. He then besieged the castle, but Isabel refused to surrender to him. Instead, she ordered a man to be lowered from the castle battlements with instructions to get word to her followers, and to inform them of her plight. And they promptly responded. Her household, reinforced by allied knights and infantry from Meath and Ulster, withstood the siege, and they defeated Meiler and devastated his lands, which included the castle of Dunamace. Now, the humiliation for Meiler was profound. Not only was he defeated by the courage and cunning of a woman, but Isabel also demanded that he submit to her and give his son as a hostage for his good behaviour. She also forced the other rebel knights of Leinster to come to terms and surrender their children or brothers as hostages. Her decisive actions restored her family's firm grip on Leinster and forced an unhappy king to impart the good news of her victory to her husband waiting in England. William was then allowed to return from England, and he reigned with Isabella in Kilkenny until 1213, when he was again summoned back to England by the king. William and Isabel had constant issues with the temperamental bad King John, as he was known in history, But in the end, when he was dying, he relied on the loyalty of the Marshal and the kind heart of Isabel to oversee the peaceful transition of the reign of his son and heir, the young King Henry II. At 70 years old, Marshal was made regent for the 9-year-old King Henry, and so the wheel had turned full circle. For now Isabel, who had spent her young life in the Tower of London, being watched over by Henry II's men, was now in the role of the regent's wife and charged with the guidance and protection of the young King Henry III, who was the grandson of Henry II. William died in 1219, and he was buried in the Temple Church in London, where his effigy can still be viewed. His will provided that the lands he held in the right of his wife should revert to her for her lifetime. But unfortunately, Isabel didn't get to enjoy her newfound independence for very long, because she died the following year after him at her castle in Chepstow, aged only about 48. And she was buried in the family abbey of Tintern in Wales beside her mother Aoife. Now, she would have died, I'm sure, quite confident that due to all her husband and her work in the efforts to keep her inheritance secure. But sadly, that was not to be the case, as her 5 sons died without legitimate heirs. This resulted in all the lands being divided up between her 5 daughters, who had married into some of the most powerful families in Ireland and England. So once again, the lands of Leinster were passed down through the female line. This was for the 3rd time. Kilkenny Castle and surrounding land went to the descendants of Isabel's daughter, Isabel Marshal. She had married one of her de Clare cousins. The de Clare sold the castle and lands to the Despencer family in 1317, and they sold it on to James Butler, 3rd Earl of Ormond, in 1391. Now the Despensers and the Butlers were also descended from Isabel through her daughter Maud Marshal. So Isabel's legacy actually continued in Kilkenny with the owners of the castle through the de Clares, the Despensers, and through the Butlers of Ormond, who held the castle until the 1960s, when they then handed it over to the people of Kilkenny. Her legacy was not confined to Ireland, because her daughter's descendants included many who played the Game of Thrones in England, Scotland, and Europe, including Robert the Bruce, Mary Queen of Scots, and 5 of Henry VIII's queens. It was the fate of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard to be lodged in the Tower of London before their beheading, a place where their ancestor Isabel had been lodged many years before. So now, when you travel around Kilkenny and observe all the remaining medieval features in the city, county, and further afield, just remember that William Marshal was not solely responsible for their creation, but he generally gets the credit for her. But remember that Isabel, his wife, from whom he acquired the lands, was a very active participant in the creation of this medieval city, and that we know and enjoy today. Now, I think you can see from the slides all the various people that the wives of Henry VIII and Mary Queen of Scots and Robert the Bruce. So I'll finish with the words that the Marshal used many times in his lifetime when he was referring to Isabel. I have no claim to anything here save through her.